everybody's ready, we'll go ahead and get started. I know that we want to get out of here on time so the folks at the plant board can go home since they've been here all day. I'm Harry Carver, and I'm the chair of the group of coordinators of Together Frankfort. For those of you that haven't heard me go through this before, Together Frankfort was founded about 7 years ago by a group of volunteers that were concerned about the state of our elections. In a community meeting, they established two main goals for the group: to register folks to vote and to provide accurate and timely information to help educate voters. To this end, Together Frankfort has organized and hosted a variety of events over the years to inform and engage the citizens of Frankfort and Franklin County, including candidate forums and public discussions on a wide range of issues, with expert panels, as we have tonight. Together Frankfort has sponsored demonstrations, letter writing campaigns, and community events such as Earth Day, which was great this year if anybody missed it, down at Liberty. Oh, actually, it was at behind the Orlando Brown House. It was a great event and a great location. But above all, voter registration events are held throughout the year at every opportunity. We also would like to invite you to join Together Frankfort. If you're here in the building tonight, Linda will sign you up, or you can join us, on our website or on Facebook, I think. Also, we'd be happy if you would contribute. These forums, or the publicizing of them and everything is not free, and we would appreciate any help we can get there. We embarked on a series of forums this year called Civics 101, because we felt that there was folks were just didn't really understand a lot of the issues in our community, and so this has given us the opportunity month by month to tackle a new issue and dig into it a little deeper and give folks a chance to get a better understanding. This is the fifth one in the series, and they are all, for those of you that might have missed any of the previous ones, there should be a link on our website, or you can go to the Plant Board's YouTube channel. I think they're all posted there as well. Tonight is the fifth, as I said, in the series, and the title is "What Are They Hiding? An Assault on Open Government." But before I introduce our panels, I want to recognize a couple of our local elected officials who are actually right now at this very moment working to make some public records more accessible. Our county clerk, Jeff Hancock, and the PVA, Will Rhodes, are working, and actually some of it is, if you go on there, you can see that it started, that you can go to the PVA website, and when you look at a particular property card, you can click on it and go straight to the deed and in some cases now the plat for that piece of property, which is really exciting to be able to do that now. So I just, I think it's, there's so much bad stuff going on. It's always nice to recognize, good things that are happening in our community, particularly when it comes to government in the sunshine. So speaking of government in the sunshine, I'll introduce our two advocates here. I'll start with Amy, I guess, Bensonhaber, who's fairly famous in our world, actually, in Frankfort. She's a retired assistant attorney general. She was, for 25 years, under 6 attorneys general. She authored legally binding decisions on open records and open meeting disputes, responded to inquiries concerning the open records and open meeting laws, and regularly made presentations to public officials and others on the laws. In 2019, she and Jennifer Brown, the former editor of the Kentucky New Era, established the Kentucky Open Government Coalition, a nonpartisan nonprofit organization with a mission to expand citizen awareness and understanding of Kentucky's open government laws, to advocate for those laws, and to provide a voice for citizens on open government issues. Amy is the 2016 recipient of the University of Kentucky Scripps Howard First Amendment Center's James Madison Award, and she earned her BA from Centre College and her JD from University of Kentucky. And our other panelist tonight is Janie Lindell, who is a member at large of the League of Women Voters. And for those of you that don't know, the League of Women Voters recently published a study on some of the darkness that occurs in our legislative process. So that's why we have invited her here tonight. She is the E.T. Moore Distinguished Professor Emerita of Educational Leadership at Clemson University and is a retired department chair. She's also served in academic roles at the University of Pittsburgh and the University of Kentucky, which I assume is what brought her here. And her scholarship is focused on educational policy and politics. She's the past editor of Educational Administration Quarterly and past president of the Politics of Education Association. She's also, in her spare time, a certified Kentucky Master Gardener and is an active member with the League of Women Voters. So we are going to start with Amy, and I think Janie can jump in at any time if she feels so inclined, and we'll let Amy get started. Thank you.
Do I activate this? This is being taped. So activate this?
It should. Is it on? Can you just?
It's a
green
green
light,
light,
yeah.
so I think we're good.
It should be good.
Okay. Well, thank you for inviting me here tonight. As I was telling Barbara, the greatest challenge for me is restricting myself to 15 minutes of discussion, because typically I can talk for 6 hours about this without drawing a breath. So the truth is, this is the greatest challenge to me, is narrowing my focus to just the topic for tonight. So I want to begin by sort of describing the backstory so that we can have some appreciation for the law and why we are where we are today. In 1967, the United States enacted the Federal Freedom of Information Act. It was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson, who has been described as very reluctant in the signing ceremony to sign the document. Within a few years, we were in the midst of Vietnam, and very quickly thereafter, we were in the midst of the Watergate scandal. And as a result of that, a lot of states started enacting open records and open meetings laws, including Kentucky. So in 1974, we get an open records and an open meetings bill enacted into law. But then Governor Ford vetoed the open records law, which is kind of interesting. I've only recently got to immerse myself in the history of these laws, but Governor Ford at that time, Wendell Ford, was concerned about the lack of what he perceived as to be a lack of protection for personal privacy and for economic development type records. And what I found, much to my glee, is that in the interim between when we didn't have annual sessions, in that interim period, a representative from Danville, who is someone I deeply respect, named Joe Clark, shepherded the open records law to passage. It was truly Joe Clark to whom we all owe an enormous debt. And in those laws, the preamble to those laws, there are statements of legislative policy that still exist in the law. For example, in the open meetings law, the formation of public policy is public business and shall not be conducted in secret. And in the open records law, free and open examination of public records is in the public interest, even though examination may cause inconvenience or embarrassment to public officials or others. That language still appears in the statutes, but unfortunately, Kentucky's legislative supermajority has abandoned these policies altogether. Moreover, public agencies in general go to extraordinary lengths to circumvent them. So although they still exist in statute, we can honestly say that our law is starting to really recognize a departure from what was the original impetus for the law. And I asked myself as I was preparing today, I wonder at what point understandable resentment toward the law. Agencies don't necessarily like having to fulfill open records requests. They can be a nuisance. They disrupt what they view as their essential functions. But at some point that resentment turned into resistance, and that's what we're witnessing today, an actual attack or assault on open records law and open meetings laws from various places. I will say that when I came to the law in 1991, there was still a level of adherence to the law and appreciation for the law. In general, we were still generating a lot of decisions in response to appeals, but we had a pretty robust law at that point. And in general, the attorneys general that I worked with, in general, to a point, were acutely aware of the need not to politicize this particular area in which the AG acts in a quasi-adjudicative role. As much as possible, he should be entirely objective in adjudicating these disputes. And because before that, in order to advance that, the staff at that time was almost exclusively, in fact, it was exclusively a merit staff. In other words, with civil service protection. That is not to say that Democrats have not done bad things to our law. In 2012, for example, in response to a really ugly situation down in Pike County involving a group called Utilities Management Group, which was I don't know if anybody's aware of that situation, but they amended the law to essentially give utility management group and like entities a pass. They amended the statute relating to what we call the 25% rule. Entities that derive at least 25% or more of their funds from state or local authority, to the extent of that funding, their records are public. The legislature, and this was Democrats, basically excluded any funds derived under a competitively bid contract, which basically took a lot of the meat out of the statute. But the serious emergence of threats to the open records law really began, and again, I can say this because, with our group is a bipartisan group, we're very aware, but the truth is these problems really started to emerge when the Republican supermajority arose in the legislature. So in the period from about 2017 to 2024, we saw, for example, a proliferation in the number of exceptions to the open records law. There had always been a relatively confined set of exceptions that were recognized in the law, and since that period, we've seen these exceptions introduced in a very reactive kind of way to what's happening in the courts or whatever, for public procurement, for personal communications, and for what they described originally as gruesome photographs, the sort of George Floyd video, surveillance video, or videos taken. So we have specific exceptions being added to the law now to address what is perceived as a problem, when in reality, and what we've tried to argue to the legislature, is the law already adequately addresses this through existing exceptions. The newer development, which actually has a predecessor, but is to define the terms. And since, the threshold issue with an open records request or appeal or dispute is it a public record? Is this a public agency? And this new supermajority seems intent on redefining terms like public record and public agency in a way that will exclude far more than it will include. These have always been very inclusive definitions. And so in 2018, for example, Damon Thayer tried to redefine public record to exclude any communications on a private cell phone or device. That was defeated, but we got a new exception as a result of that. And then, of course, in 2024, we saw House Bill 509. Are most of you familiar with House Bill 509? Okay, House Bill 509 was probably, in my view, and in every session there seems to be one lesser or greater attack on the open records law. And this is a national trend across, you will find in every state something very much, virtually every state, something very much like this. But House Bill 509 basically was targeting the discussions that public officials conduct on their private devices to evade public scrutiny. And it's got a history within the AG's office that is very dark and unpleasant. But the truth is, that's what the House Bill 509, which really would have gutted the open records law, because it is a dead-on certainty, no matter what is argued, that any official who wishes to evade scrutiny need only understand that if he does it on his private device, he's in the clear. He can do anything on his private device and avoid any kind of oversight. That would have pushed everybody onto their private devices, whether it was open meetings, whether it was open records. And so there was a strong pushback against that. And what we discovered, and others have discovered before us, is that the beauty of the open records law is that it truly does capture people on every place on this political spectrum, far right, far left. I was pointing out to someone today that Adrienne Southworth, who is someone that I know people have some issues with on a lot of other questions, she has been a stalwart for open government from the first day she entered the legislative chambers. And she, in 2021, voted against, first year in office, voted against House Bill 312 that basically excluded the legislature from the open records law. She was very vocal about that. So the truth is, you're going to find people at either end of the extreme and everybody in between who supports the notion of open government. Who does not support the notion of open government are the people who hold power, the elected officials who resent the fact that they have to be scrutinized. So, or that they are subject, they are accountable through their records and through their meetings. That is where the problem lies. So again, the 2021 Act of the General Assembly to exclude itself from the open records law was one of the most appalling acts of self-serving. I can't even begin to describe to you how offensive that is, because if ever there were an agency that required oversight, it is the Kentucky General Assembly. And they have simply ignored the open meetings law. There is no ifs, ands, or buts. They are subject to the open meetings law. This is what Janie will be discussing with you, but the reality is, in 2018, the Franklin Circuit Court, in a case that involved Jeff Hoover, then Speaker of the House, and the Bluegrass Institute, determined that, in fact, the legislature was a public agency. There was no question, but they obviously were ignoring it. And at that point, they had actually had a closed session of the entire House of Representatives to discuss a pension issue, a pension report. They excluded the press, they excluded the public, they closed the doors, they locked the doors, and only one person left, and that was Representative Jim Wayne from Louisville, who said, this violates the open meetings law. So as I said, that's been the most galling. They have a mechanism within their own open records light law that provides for review within the agency, but it is a meaningless process, and they have actually excluded themselves from any kind of judicial oversight. So if they deny a request, there's no recourse to the courts. You're not getting their records. Okay. The second threat, unfortunately, is now coming from the Kentucky Attorney General's office. So in addition to the legislative threat, we also have now a threat from the Kentucky Attorney General's office. And at least the last administration, this administration is fairly new, fairly untested, but the reality is the staff remains the same. So the likelihood is nothing will change. And a lot of that staff, a lot of the high-ranking officials in that staff are holdovers from the Matt Bevin Office of Legal Counsel, who have a lot of animus toward the open records law. So with the arrival of Daniel Cameron, we saw essentially an attorney general who was absolutely dismissive of everything that came before him, contemptuous of anything that suggested that prior decisions of the Attorney General should guide interpretation. I mean, that has been the fundamental, whether the Attorney General himself agreed or did not agree. It's a governing precedent. You follow it unless and until there is a specific reason. The law changes. The courts tell us that interpretation is wrong. You don't just willy-nilly change the law. That has not stopped this Attorney General. So, and this is manifested in several ways, including the cases involving public discussions on private devices, and that's a case involving the group I work with, the Kentucky Open Government Coalition, and the Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources Commission. It is now on petition for discretionary review in the Supreme Court. At every level we have prevailed. It is very obvious that the law as it's currently written encompasses, captures all of these records. It doesn't matter where the record is stored. It is the purpose and intent of the record. Why are we communicating? Not where we're storing those records. That determines whether or not the open records law applies. So that's where we are with the case that's now in the Kentucky Supreme Court. I think it is important to note too that the Cameron administration quickly populated what was once called the opinions branch with non-merit staff, which obviously is a segue into politicization. That's going to politicize the office. People who can be fired at will are not going to stand up for the law. I did not endear myself to my managers by trying to advocate for the open government laws, but I had some protection through the merit system that ensured that I couldn't be fired without cause. One of the other things that the Cameron administration did was essentially to say that the requirements for going into closed session, which are, basically the way we know, basically we know we're going into closed session to discuss pending litigation against XYZ Corporation and to protect our litigation strategy. They basically said all of those are voluntary. You don't have to do them. And in fact, you might as well just take final action in closed session too. So that issue is now in the courts. It was resolved in the Oldham Circuit Court in favor of the complainant. In other words, the Attorney General's longstanding interpretation was affirmed and Cameron's interpretation was rejected, and the court was very adamant that it was not with the Attorney General's privilege to simply ignore years of precedent. If he was going to change his position, there had to be a plausible, legal, defensible explanation for doing so. And again, as I said, the problem with Russell Coleman is that he has kept the same staff. And so a lot of what is happening now is just, more of the same. And I have to add, sadly, that I cannot speak too favorably of our governor at this point on matters concerning open government. Again, I cannot impress upon you how serious the threat to open government House Bill 509 was in this legislative session. We came within a hair's breadth, and believe me, it was not through any effort of any great advocacy group. It was because the legislatures either lost the will to enact that law, but that bill was sponsored by a kind of unknown guy from Louisville named Hodgson. He was a new representative, brand new, and then Jason Nemes, who's pretty powerful, and David Osborne. They were the co-sponsors. And the idea basically was, first of all, we are going to gut the law by essentially taking anything of a deliberative nature, anything that helps the public understand how we arrived at this policy. We're going to say that is exempt. And that was fundamentally the goal. They would take take one step back, and then they would take two steps forward and doing even worse things. But what happened, it appears to me, is the governor was supporting this bill all along. He even indicated that his staff had worked with the legislature on this bill, and he would not stand down from his support for this bill, while at the same time asserting that he was absolutely the most transparent governor we had ever had. And the problem with that is his track record does not bear that out. You ask any reporter who's made a request or any citizen who's made a request to the governor's office for records of the governor's administration, they're as guilty of stonewalling as any other agency in state government. And that is absolutely, I can say that objectively. I mean, I get calls a lot about, are they right about this? And the answer is no. They're nitpicking. They're expending far more energy to avoid the open records law than simply to fulfill your request. So there is a problem in that office, and I can't explain it. I do think it is possible that he had seen the light by the end of the session and was going to veto the bill, and they were planning to pass it in the veto override period. And I think it is possible that because they had heard he was planning to veto it and he would be the hero, that maybe that's why they didn't act on it. They didn't act on it. It just sort of died. But it had momentum. It was moving. So in addition to the legislature, the Attorney General, and sadly I say, of course, when it was Matt Bevin, I could have said without any hesitation, this is not a friend of open government. Governor Beshear has not shown thus far himself to be a great friend of open government. I probably should mention this first, but it's almost as if, to me, public agencies take their cues from officials, and so public agency obstructionism has become far more of a problem. Agencies, as I said, go to extraordinary lengths to try to find ways to evade open records requests. Even though the resident requirement, only residents of Kentucky can use the open records law since 2021. And at the time, it was kind of like, well, it's going to be a very porous requirement. You don't have to show a photo ID. It's pretty porous. But now agencies are really pushing back on that, so that you find a lot of people who are getting their requests are being rejected based on the lack of proof of residency. The thing that's just especially galling to me is very precise requests are being characterized by agencies as too vague and too nonspecific or too burdensome. And in a world of digitization and automation, it makes absolutely no sense when they make these arguments. And of course, agencies are becoming increasingly notorious for ignoring deadlines. The statute was amended in 2021, I believe, to extend the statutory deadline from 3 days to 5 business days for an agency to respond. But that is basically, in the eyes of agencies, instead of being the law, which it is, it's treated as some sort of aspirational goal. In other words, we're gonna say, well, it's not really convenient for us to do this within 5 business days. We're going to give ourselves an extra month to do this. That is not uncommon. And of course, the chief offenders, they're chief offenders everywhere, but anyone who's read anything about Louisville and their problems, LMPD, Louisville Metro, they have serious problems. And the system that they call, it's a portal you use to get to their records, Next Request, really is the problem with it is I've filed requests under it, and you might have a 5-part request. They answer one part of the request and then they close it, and it's all automated, so you're kind of like, what do I do next? So the truth is there's public agency obstructionism at a level that I've never witnessed before. But I will say that in Kentucky we have been very fortunate to have courts. Our courts have generally understood and appreciated the value of these laws and have endorsed that through their holdings. Of course, we are extremely spoiled in Franklin County to have probably the greatest judge. Judge Philip Shepard is without peer. He understands this law in a way that nobody else does, and he interprets the law consistent with the bias that the law itself expresses. The courts have said, the Supreme Court of Kentucky, our law exhibits a bias favoring disclosure. My superiors used to accuse me of being biased. And I would say, well, that bias is consistent with the bias of the statute and this idea that free and open examination of public records is in the public interest. I believe that Judge Shepard understands this law in a way that very few do. But I say that knowing that I have observed judges in other jurisdictions in other circuits who have no reason to know this law nearly as well. Think how many cases arise in Franklin County, state agency, cases go to the Franklin Circuit Court. There are judges across the state who have shown me they have the stuff. There's an Oldham County Circuit judge who did a remarkable job on an open meetings case. The case I was telling you about involving Daniel Cameron's interpretation of the requirements for going into closed session. Barron County judge who has ruled against the Cabinet for Health and Family Services that just can't seem to get it right. And in some instances in Jefferson County, we see some good judges coming in there. I think one of the things that we're kind of acutely aware of, at least I am, is this idea that there is a desire to replace people like Philip Shepard, Michelle Keller at the Supreme Court level. So in the last judicial races, where a lot of money was expended to try to get those people out of office, it was really a frightening time. I can only tell you that Justice Keller has done a remarkable job on the Supreme Court. Judge Shepard, as I said, is peerless. One of the problems we have right now is that we have a new configuration on both courts, Court of Appeals and Supreme Court. We lost some of our stalwarts. Chief Justice Minton was absolutely a stalwart for open government. Justice Abramson wrote the last 5 or 6 opinions, major opinions and in-depth opinions favoring public access, both very good and they've retired. And at the Court of Appeals level, a judge named Irv Mays, who wrote the Cabinet for Health and Family Services opinions back in 2016, I think it was, dealing with the obstreperousness of the Cabinet in disclosing records relating to child fatalities, and affirming the $756,000 in penalties that were assessed against the Cabinet, and a very eloquent discussion of why these fines, although they seem like enormous fines, are commensurate with the wrong that is being done. So at this moment in time, we have several cases pending in the Kentucky Supreme Court, and we haven't yet seen how this court is going to deal with these issues. So I have to honestly say I'm a little nervous. The case that I'm involved in is the coalition that I work with is involved in is at the Supreme Court right now, and I have to admit I'm a little nervous. With the courts really don't have the kind of deadlines that most of us are accustomed to. And so the petition for discretionary review was filed in November of last year, and we're still waiting on them to rule on whether they will rule. In other words, they have to decide first whether they're going to accept discretionary review. And they have three options. They can accept discretionary review and basically hear the case again, and it could take another year to 2 years to get it resolved. Or they could deny discretionary review at the Court of Appeals, very strong opinion stand. Or they could deny discretionary review and depublish the Court of Appeals opinion, which would be a dreadful outcome for us because we've come so far. But having said that, I will say any judicial victory, you can expect an equal and opposite reaction from the legislature. So this is why we're in such a tailspin in the state right now with regard to open government, because for every step forward we take, the legislature deals as a major blow. And that is really all I have, so I'm going to turn it over to JD.
I will say I was in there for the testimony in the committee of House Bill 509, and one little piece of drama that was interesting was the attorney for the Press Association spoke, and then right behind him came the attorney for, I think it's called Better America.
Americans for Prosperity.
Yeah, Americans for Prosperity. And they kind of looked at each other and turned to the legislative committee and said, if we're both in the same room upset about this bill, you need to worry. And I do think that had a huge influence on the end of the story, even though nobody wanted to back off and say they weren't pressing ahead. I really do think the fact that both sides of the issue showed up, both speaking for open government, and particularly for open records. So the League of Women Voters, you may know, for voting rights, and that is in fact part of our mission. Been in existence for 100 years, and we don't really follow candidates, but we do follow issues, and so we monitor what's going on at the legislature, because you can see on the handout, one of our principles is that if a decision is going to affect a citizen, the citizen has a right to participate in that decision. And in particular, that means at the local level, it's really, really important that your voices can be heard in any kind of agency or government group that is making decisions about your life. So one of the ways that we do this is we do follow local activities. We do have different groups all across the Commonwealth, but we also have legislative liaisons that follow both federal and state law. And there's a group of us that show up regularly and watch the YouTube channel for all the committees regularly, and watch the chamber activities on KET regularly. And one of the things we observed at the end of the 2023 session was we had this sort of vague feeling that things were just not operating rationally, and stuff was getting rushed through without citizens' ability to participate or speak up. Now, some of the things that have happened since 2018, when they had the wastewater bill that became the teacher retirement bill, that's just one example of several different things that's going on with issues that are huge like that. But all of the issues that any of those committees and the chambers themselves address are important to someone in Kentucky, and thus means that it may look like here's what's going on with getting driver's licenses for motorcycles, but it's still important to the people who have to get the driver's license for the motorcycle. So we wanted to make sure that we understood exactly what was happening in this sort of fast track approach. So we decided, because the bill histories are really more expressly described in the legislative record. Now, the official constitutional record of legislation is the journal, but the legislative record gives you a blow-by-blow all through the life of the bill, whereas the journal really tells you what the chamber finally decided, whether it's the Senate or the House. But the legislative record can tell you what happened every step of the way. So we went to the ones that were available online. That took us back to 1998. And then we selected 7 of the regular sessions. So we went 98, 2002, 2006, 2010, 2014, 2018, and 2022. And I'll speak in a minute about the fact that we're doing 2024. But the reason we took that was because we knew if we started complaining about the most recent activities, what we'd hear is the other party did it. We're nonpartisan. We don't care whether the parties are having tit for tat. We just want to know when citizens have an opportunity to participate. And it appeared to us they were not having much opportunity to participate. So we went back, and in 98, that's what this graph shows. In 98, all of these are sort of like the total ways that things had been rushed through without much citizen participation. And what we can say is it wasn't like this in 98. Now, I know that a lot of people are not fans of statistics, but this is called a trend line. And I think the important thing to note is, even though it wiggles a little bit, if you look at 2022, is it still above where it was in 98? Now, when we released this in November, what we got was pushback from legislators who said, oh, but we went down. You're not telling the story about when we went down. Well, here's the thing. In 98, when they were very close together, it showed the two houses were not operating much differently. And I can imagine in certain kinds of appropriations like floods and tornadoes, you do want to move quickly. So 2 or 3% is probably not an unreasonable rate. But I'm sorry, if a quarter to a third of what you're passing has been rushed through so that people can't participate, I think that's a rate we can complain about. Here are the 4 things that we discovered they were doing. They were sending the bills to be read in the chamber before they'd ever been heard in a committee. So the way it's supposed to go is this chart on the back, where you're supposed to send it to a committee. The committee has its deliberations. You can participate and testify. And then it goes to the chamber with a recommendation from the committee. They hear it one day. They hear it a second day. And then they vote on it a third day. That is not what they're doing. They are skipping over these readings by putting them before the committee. Now, how can you call it a reading if you don't even have the version that the committee sends you? And then they receive it from the committee, so the committees meet in the morning, the chambers convene at 2. So they receive it from the committee. If your committee met at 9 o'clock, you might have, 2 or 3 hours before you hit the chamber? But what's happening in many, many cases is the fact that not every legislator sits on every committee. So even legislators who are not on the committee that sent it forward don't know what's in that bill. There's no time for a citizen to contact their legislator and say, here's what you need to know about this bill. So rearranging when the readings are and skipping over the process really takes this sort of gold standard of all the ways that people could participate out of the mix. And the other things that we do see is that instead of writing amendments, they make something called a committee substitute, which means that you can't even tell what the original bill says because the substitute isn't the original bill. And on top of it, unlike all the conventions where you have the strike-throughs and the underlining, you're not going to see that in the committee substitute because it only goes back to the original statute. So you can't see what changed in the bill. You can only see how it's changing the statute. The other thing they do is something called a free conference committee and a free conference committee. And that means that once a bill passes from one house, goes over to the other house's committee, gets to the chamber's floor, and they vote on it, they may in fact have ended up with a committee substitute that completely changed the bill as it came over from the other house. So then they have a conference committee, and what they're supposed to do is work out their differences. Well, what's happening right now, from what we can see, and we're investigating this further, is that they don't work out their differences. They just hold firm, declare the fact that the conference committee couldn't agree, and appoint a free conference committee. And then they go in a room and shut the door, and no one can see what's going on, and they come out with some kind of, they could have thrashed it out in the conference committee. There's nothing that says that you have to hold firm. It's in fact supposed to be a deliberative process. But when I confronted a representative and said, I just want to know as a citizen what the difference you think is between a conference committee and a free conference, the person flat out said, well, there's more freedom in a free conference. Meaning nobody's watching us and we can do what we want. So we have asked that in November, we told them we knew what they were up to. We realized that what they could easily do is just rewrite the rules to enshrine what they were doing. They didn't rewrite a single thing. They kept their same rules. And from what we can tell, they still are doing the 4 things. We're fairly certain of that. But as you know, we kind of have to wait until all the official documentation is done, and it wasn't done till May 8th. And not all of it is done. I'm just going to say this out loud in front of you. Put it in your head. You know the journals aren't available after 2019?
No, I didn't.
So they have not done 2020, 2020, all the way through, 2019 is the most recent they've done. They have USB drives for that. But if you go to the library, the only hard copy they have is up to 2018. So just put that bee in your bonnet. They're understaffed, you know. Anyway, the thing that we suggest is that we have 4 things that we really are 100% behind as the league. One thing is that all citizens have a voice. When it's operating correctly, you can call your representatives, you can call your senator, you can send emails, you can make appointments with them, and you get to and some of them will even do Zoom now with their appointments. So kudos to them. They do care about, many of them do care about their constituents. So we encourage that kind of participation. We also encourage people to show up and testify about bills they care about. And that they have to have the opportunity because they have to know when the committees are meeting. Open meetings law, right? Mm-hmm. And so if you know when the meetings are, you can go to them. Well, let me tell you, watch the legislative schedule on a daily basis because they get canceled. And you could drive all the way from Bowling Green or from Prestonsburg or from Paducah, get there and there's no meeting. And then they might have it later upon adjournment of the chamber. So upon adjournment of the House, upon adjournment of the... So that's not good. I mean, it doesn't even follow their own rules. And they can write their own rules. This is the thing that's sort of frustrating. They can write their own rules. When you run into things like that, we strongly recommend that you do what people do when their voices aren't heard. You can take to the streets and use peaceful protest to indicate that you know what's going on and that you don't like it. The final thing, of course, is the number one thing for the league, and that is vote. Make sure you talk people into, good people, into running. So there actually are contests in these elections, and so that you can actually have representatives and senators who do, in fact, care about their constituents and what their constituents want to be able to say and do. Now, as I said, we are looking at 2024, and there have been a few other things that have popped up. None of this is official, But you know that canceling of regular scheduled meetings, we're a little salty about that. And we also notice that then what they do is have these special meetings instead of the regular scheduled meetings. Again, open meetings law. Because you're supposed to have 24 hours notice, correct? We canceled it this morning, but we're having it on adjournment of the House. Is that 24 hours? It's not a whole day. The other thing that we're noticing about the records, the journals, just one little thing we figured out. It's really hard to find minutes for committee meetings. And the other thing that we're really upset about, because we want to see it in the journal, is when they declare a conference committee, do they say who these are the people we appoint? Now, we've watched chamber meetings and it's kind of boring and we're not convinced we haven't missed something, but on the other hand, we think they aren't actually saying who's on the committees. And that should be in the journal because that's part of the process. The other thing that has turned up since about 2018 is something that we're referring to as shell bills. Now, in the legislative process, it has been the case all along, they even do this in the federal government, that they start out with a bill that's doing one thing, and then they gut it and put something else completely different in it. And I do think there have been a couple of Supreme Court cases, actually, that, and you would know this better than me, that actually have said, if the bill started out, say, as an appropriations bill, but it was like appropriations for Medicare, and then you changed it to appropriations for the Department of Commerce, you don't really have to have separate appropriation bills for every single agency. So it's okay if it was originally an appropriations bill. What's not okay is if it starts out being like an appropriations bill and then it turns out to be about anything that actually isn't involving any appropriations, just telling you can or can't do something like criminal law or something like that. You can't really switch that much. However, what we're seeing are bills that are filed that say an act for education. This one is the one that to me is the most infamous because it shows up every year in 4 or 5 different versions, but it's not really different versions. It says an act to amend KRS 156-690 to change to gender neutral language. Well, when you open it up, it says in 3 lines, because they number the lines, that every teacher in Kentucky should have his or her own computer. They've never passed this. They've never passed it. And they file it 5 or 6 different times under different individuals. And it just sits there. And so when you hear about 1,200 bills being filed in one session, you got to ask yourself how many of them are these shells that are just sitting there for something else maybe to happen. And one of their characteristics is there's always a deadline by which you have to file all the bills you're going to file. These tend to show up the last 2 days. So it's clear we're calling them the right things because they're putting in this almost empty bill and they're letting it sit there just in case they need something to fill it up with. And they make sure that it covers every topic, so there are different ones with different numbers. And that, there are basic rules for how you write these laws. These have all the basics, but as a former teacher, and I see work that's, at the minimum, my immediate reaction is, oh my, you could do better than this. You have way more potential, you're just not using it. So that's, I'm open for questions and of course comments. I used to have a colleague that said, and rude remarks, but I've decided I don't like those. So.
Does anybody have a question?
Yes, sir. So you keep referring to they, which implies that there is some person or people that are sort of orchestrating these things, like who determines that things are going to operate in the way that they are
Each chamber
operating?
gets to write its own rules. Now, after we did our report,
There are people who are writing the rules for each chamber.
Leadership.
yeah.
Leadership.
Well, yes, and one of the outcomes of us releasing the initial report was there were in the House subgroups of legislators who started writing alternative rules. And they had like a 3-hour discussion about their rules. In the Senate, that leadership sort of kiboshed it, said that, you know, like the Wizard of Oz, there's nothing happening here. There's nothing happening here. Ignore the wizard behind the curtain, or the man behind the curtain. So they only spent about an hour on it. But it is longer in both cases than what they generally do when they talk about rules. Usually it's a pro forma kind of approach where they just adopt the rules they had before, basically. And that's what they did. They eventually adopted the rules they had before. And we had a little pushback from different members of leadership and individuals, representatives and senators, who kept saying that we had written the wrong report. Well, what we found out was they were conflating what this group were doing with the alternative rules. So none of what they proposed was anything we suggested. We just suggested they follow their own rules.
Don?
Yeah, Amy, with the open records law, now that most things are digital, and so you request a document of whatever, and when the agency wants to give it to you digitally, but you would like to have it on paper, is there anything in the law that says how much they can charge you for that, or is it just reasonable or whatever?
Yeah, we're very fortunate in this state because although the statute says a reasonable fee based on, actual costs, it says medium and mechanical processing costs. In the 80s, there was a case called Friend versus Rees in which the court basically said 10 cents is not per page is not unreasonable. It's actually in a state regulation, so that applies to state agencies and local agencies if they have not adopted their own regulations. So 10 cents per page is what we sort of have lived with, and yeah, it's probably inflated in all candor, because if it is supposed to be actual cost excluding staff costs, that is one of the great virtues of our statute, is that we exclude staff costs as to everyone except commercial requesters, people who intend to use records to generate money, to make a profit. So yeah, it should be 10 cents per page.
It can still get expensive.
It could get expensive, but listen, in some states, Virginia, for example, there's just they charge for staff time, and you can have a request that would $40,000. There are instances in which people are absolutely foreclosed from accessing records because of the cost associated. And in Kentucky, if you do accept electronic copies and they're transmitted electronically, they can't charge you anything because there's no actual cost incurred, and they can't charge you for staff time. So, yeah.
Marilyn?
I just wanted to make an observation. I started working at the LRC probably 1978 or 80. And there were a few times where they didn't go through those readings, but very seldom. And that is clearly a change. But committee substitutes were always part of the process from the time I was there. It was assumed, and I'm not arguing pro or con, but sometimes it is a little, when you've got a lot of amendments and you're agreeing to them, sometimes it's easier to put them in a committee sub, I guess, for the
Right.
board. There are, you could argue
Right.
either way on that. And the free conference was pretty much standard too.
Right.
Those two
We're not
things
saying
have
they're
been
not
there.
standard. They're part of the rules. It's the way they're doing it that we have questions about. And the same thing with the committee sub. So Piggyback amendments are really verboten, and one of the ways around a piggyback amendment is to do a committee sub instead. So if it's in a committee sub, you borrowed from another bill or something like that, that's perfectly fine. That's the way the rule is written. But it does get confusing if they're doing them boom, 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 and you don't have time to read it. Some of these subs are not even available to the committee members until the moment they walk in.
They're not going through those other rules.
Yeah, right. They're skipping steps.
When I was doing bills, it was always really important it was all about the title. It was hard to change unless you could still keep the title. And so, as a good government worker, bill drafter, I always tried to keep a real narrow title to make it harder. But then in the final days, I'd be told to find a bill that would fit under it, and so I was kind of working against myself. You know, I had to work just the opposite.
Well, you can also see some of that, to me, just having read so many legislative records, you can kind of see some of that contradiction in the actual indexing. So the bill itself doesn't look like this, but the way it got indexed, you're kind of going, oh, somebody really saw this. So I do think that I was at another presentation. Somebody said something about LRC staffers speaking up, and I'm like, they're following the rules. They're doing, and they work for leadership. So, you know, it's a rough situation. Yeah, so it's very helpful, the information that LRC has on how to draft a bill, because it then helps you understand when you're looking at the bill history, kind of more about what sort of machinations were going on actually in committees or even somewhere else, and seeing, you know, that the bill did start out the way it was supposed to be, but stuff happened.
Barbara.
I know you haven't researched this, but do you think this same opinion, I mean, you mentioned Louisville, I mean, is it filtering down to local government? Are they sort of, do you have an idea whether or not this is happening in local government?
No, honestly, I can't say, other than, you know, my participation in Woodford County, things are fairly transparent. Everything's on Facebook, and the Woodford Sun tells more than most people want to know.
You have a great county judge.
We have an excellent county
Yeah.
judge. But my husband's from Union County, and I'm not really sure what's going on out there. So that's a thing I think every citizen needs to really speak to as well.
I was wondering if either of your organizations tabulate instances. How many violations of open records? How many violations of open meetings?
Ours is a relatively new organization, and we are starting to compile data. But I will tell you, the young man who does he's not that young, the man who does our data, he's our technology guy. What I've explained to him is, so often in any given opinion, you're going to have, you know, splitting the difference. They might win on the procedural, they might lose on the procedural issue, but win on the substantive issue. In other words, you didn't respond in 5 days, but it was okay that you withheld these records. Or, you know, so it's really hard, or they might have initially just completely blown it, but then once the appeal was filed, come in and rectified their error. So it's kind of hard to draw a safe conclusion, but it's safe to say that it's keeping the Attorney General very busy. Appeals are keeping the Attorney General very busy, and I absolutely do think my predecessor in that office was a guy named Tom Emerson. Well, there was a guy in between, but Tom Emerson was my predecessor. He told me in the 80s they entertained about 50 appeals a year, and now I think last year they issued well over 300 decisions. So, you know, and these are substantive decisions. So there are violations occurring everywhere. And again, I think the tenor is set at the top. If the people at the top, if the legislature is defiant of open government, concept of open government, of course local officials are going to be, unless there's someone like James Kay, who is the best. I tend to be a little hyperbolic, but when I do like someone, and I think James Kay is, he's had me come and speak to fiscal court, I don't even in person several times. And that is dramatic to me, that he wants to comply with the law. He wants to be sure all of the agencies under the umbrella of the fiscal court are complying. But yeah, the agencies take their cues from what they're seeing at the top, and at the top we're just seeing open defiance of the law.
There is a complaint process for both, right?
We're an all-volunteer army, and basically what happens with the league is that we are guided by a policy manual from the United States League, and we also have one for Kentucky. And the way that we get behind a particular issue is that it's all done by consensus, and the local leagues and the state league get together and they talk about what they want to pursue. And transparency is one of the things that they wanted to pursue. So it's not as systematic as it would be as if we were an agency, and that, so we do have a website that lets people contact us if they have questions or bring things up, but I can honestly say that's probably maybe 20 to 30 times a year that people reach out to us.
Christy?
I just wanted to kind of, if I can keep up, Barbara, the point that's kind of gone down, especially trickling down, because it starts from the top. And so if the top is not held accountable, then anything underneath, there is going to be a situation where they also can follow suit. They don't have to be held accountable. So I think ethics and morality is what we're losing here, and that's part of the problem. When I was at LRC as a constituent services analyst, part of my job was to research some of the issues that came in. And what I started finding is there are laws, but there's no accountability if they're broken. That's not written in. A big issue was smaller towns had with the railroads, the trains. The trains would stop in the middle of the road, so people living on either side could not cross. They would stop for hours. You're not supposed to stop longer than 15 minutes. That's a law. The problem is, if they break that law, it's just a small fine. So they just pay it over and over. So these people are suffering. In fact, there was a fatality. There was someone that died because an ambulance couldn't get through and the person had a heart attack. And they just continue to pay the fee, the small fee, and it wasn't addressed. There was another issue I ran into where I think it was a death certificate issue, and that is supposed to be issued within 30 days, I believe. And they had been waiting for quite some time because it was a murder and there was an ongoing investigation. But the family was on hold because they needed this death certificate. There's no accountability when that 30 days is exceeded. There was nothing. So yes, the law's been broken, but what point is a law if there's no punishment if you break it? And so I think that the problem that we're gonna run into with open records, I think that they're gonna see the pressure and saying, okay, we need to keep these open. But the penalty for breaking that, for breaking the law in that, is going to be so minimal that they're just going to be able to do it over and over because it's gonna be a slap on the wrist and they're not gonna care. And I think that that's the problem. So it falls back into holding your legislators accountable publicly. This has to be something that's publicly, it has to be vocal. You have to call it to the carpet to say, why didn't you, why is this door closed? Why didn't you make this available? But so many people, I think, are so timid and afraid to speak up or to go against what they think is their person, their leadership and power. You can't be, you hired them, they work for you. So we just have to remember, we have to start calling them to the carpet and saying, what's going on with our laws?
Well, I think there is a perception that the open records law does not have teeth, and it actually does have teeth. It does not apply to the legislature. They removed themselves from the open records law in 2021. It's not a damn thing we can do about it.
Right.
It's not, no.
How can it apply to everyone but the ones that...
Yeah, exactly. They are still subject to the open meetings law, and there is a complaint mechanism. I I actually did contemplate filing a complaint involving these special called meetings that were kind of set for adjournment, because there's no way to calculate 24 hours back from that to see if they've complied with the special meeting notice requirements. Then House Bill 509 came along and all bets were off. My focus was exclusively on that bill, because I can assure you we would have had nothing left of open records or open meetings if that bill passes. And that bill will be back in one form or another. But when, for example, the Cabinet for Health and Family Services was found to have violated over a period of several years the open records law and failing to make available to the media child fatality reports, the penalties imposed were substantial. $756,000 in penalties based on an up to $25 a day. Then they didn't even. It started with Judge Shepard. I think it was $10 a day for each day the records were willfully withheld. The total amount was $756,000 plus attorney's fees, over $1 million. So the truth is, what happened was then Matt Bevin came into office and he settled that case. The media wasn't looking at this as some sort of cash cow. They didn't want a payoff day. They just wanted accountability. So the truth is, I think our law does. I think I'm just going to say this reputationally, I think that agency is still trying to recover from the bad press it got. And oddly enough, I'm much more sensitized now to what's going on in other states. And there's a similar issue going on in West Virginia right now that's unbelievable. And they listen. If once again, if Kentucky wants to take solace in knowing that there's a state that's doing worse than we are, you look to West Virginia. But the truth is, yeah, I'm seeing them relive, or they're living what we lived in 2010 to 2016, as the Cabinet for Health and Family Services fought tooth and nail to shield themselves from scrutiny. But again, this is where the ding does come in, because even if it's just attorney's fees, it is harder to get a court to award penalties, which is up to $25 a day for each day records are willfully withheld. It is harder to get them to impose penalties, but attorney's fees can mount up. And there was a case down at Murray State University just recently where I think that they awarded like $132,000 to the news station that had brought this case, and it was a fascinating case involving the president of the University of Murray State yielding to pressure from local officials to kill stories, to bury stories about prominent officials who had asked that they have an NPR affiliate down there, and they were trying to pressure the president, and he was yielding to that pressure to kill those stories. An open records request came about as a result of that. Very courageous news station, WPSD, and its news director Perry Box went after them, and ultimately that case was resolved in the news station's favor, and they recovered $132,000 or something like that. It was a pretty significant amount of money. But the truth is, reputationally, I think Murray suffered as a result of that. I think the transportation has always had that the transportation cabinet. The problem is, again, I do think when you have no shame, how do you shame people? And I really struggle with the shamelessness of our General Assembly. I really do. I mean, listen, when Jim Wayne walked out of that meeting, did you know Jim Wayne? One of the finest men. He walks out of the meeting and says, this violates the open meetings law. Every single member stayed in that room. And some of them are people I really admire and appreciate. But they should have left. You don't hold a closed session of the full House and then try to defend it. And that's what Judge Wingate said in the Franklin Circuit Court, and yet nothing has changed because they're shameless. They simply defy the law. That is a big problem. And it tells me that of all of the agencies in government that need to be scrutinized, they're the ones who need to be most closely scrutinized. And yet we have virtually no access.
Barbara.
I think, one legislator told me that how we change the system is to elect good people. And I think the same thing's here. It's not going to change till we elect people who care about ethics and integrity and open records and open meetings. And that could become a campaign issue. Like you said, if we publicize it, if it becomes, rises in awareness, and you start asking these people who are running for office, what is your position? it may start to make people think and spread the word and change something eventually.
Well, I will tell you, Barbara, here's the truth. You're not going to find a politician who's going to say, I think open government is bullshit. You're not going to find a politician who would openly say that.
That's not true.
Well, you're not going to find a politician who's going to speak openly in opposition to open government while he's running for public office.
I've said it. I'm running right now.
And you think
So
open
you're
government is
not saying
bullshit?
You're opposed to open government.
To open?
Yeah.
Right.
You're saying.
Oh,
Right,
yeah.
right,
Oh.
right, right, yeah.
Oh, I see what you're
Yeah.
saying.
No, because the
They're not
problem is they're gonna,
honest enough
they're,
to say that they're
right.
not gonna do that, and
They're
that's
gonna
why
give
we
lip
have to
service
hold
to
them
it.
fire and say,
Yeah.
then why did you vote?
I agree, and I also detected something else that it is this notion of entitlement. Once I get elected, then I am not responsive except to the next election. And, you know, one would think every 2 years would make you more responsive, but I don't think it does. I mean, some of what I've seen, they're counting on people forgetting stuff. And so they will do things that right before the election is flashy and constituent satisfying. But yeah, so when I say they, I do think that there is this questionable approach to working with your constituents. Yes, I want to talk to them, but I'm not sure I really want to listen to them. And that's a level. It's not that. That's a level of arrogance that once you get elected, you know everything. Like suddenly you were endowed with omniscient knowledge. I mean, surely you've got a constituent that says no, maybe knows more than you do about financing banks, or you know, something like that. So, you know, we really need the kind of leaders that are willing to go look for somebody who knows more than them when they're put into different positions, and are reaching out to their constituents and saying, can you help me figure this one out? And asking more often what it is we care about.
But I think if you do put people in the spot when they're running for office, then you have to come back to them if they've been elected and challenge them as to whether they're, you know,
Yeah.
doing what they said they would do. I mean, it has to be a very concentrated effort.
Yeah, I agree with that. You can at least hold them to their word and say, well, then you're a liar. I agree with that. I think the other thing that's, you know, concerning to me, and something that we've talked about too, is the fact that in Kentucky, we observe, as anybody who watches the legislature, which is kind of the most nauseating thing you can imagine, but anybody who does observe it observes that committee members in general are not listening. They're not, and no speaker is really given an adequate opportunity to really explain a position. In the other states that I've observed, in Arkansas, where Sarah Huckabee Sanders is the governor of Arkansas, one of her first efforts was to get their FOIA. They call it Freedom of Information Act. And there was such a hue and cry. And again, it was Americans for Prosperity and the Arkansas Press Association sitting at the same table, but they were given 7 hours, 2 days in a row, to testify against that bill. You're going to have some sway. You're going to show some, but if you've got an hour to discuss a bill and it's on the agenda with 7 other bills, any one of which might be more important in their view, and they're up there playing with their phones or chatting away or sleeping, you know, the reality is it's very hard to make an impact. And I have kind of resisted I feel guilty about not going to testify, but I know it's kind of just, you know.
Well, the testimony is usually limited. I mean, you'll be
Yeah.
told when you come in, you get 3 minutes. By the time you get up there, you get 1 minute and 30 seconds. So, you know, and if you don't really know which bill they're talking about,
Right.
because they've done a committee
Right,
substitute,
right.
you're then considered irrelevant to the whole process.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, the fix is in.
Part and parcel of hiding the ball is the way bills used to be pre-filed.
yes.
And you could go on the LRC website, let's say in November, December, early January, you could see hundreds of bills, and you could see the language that was in them. And that's been eliminated, and you really cannot tell what issues are going to be coming
Right.
up now
We-
and what the language is.
We did call them on it and sent a letter to leadership, which we need to follow up on again. But in the testimony, David Osborne said there would be a new and different website in which you could see drafts of bills. And we called him on it because he said it in both committees. He testified across the board that it was going to be. There is no such thing. When we asked where it was and when it was going to show up, we were told that it was not part of the legislation. And in the testimony, at least two of the other legislators say, I'm only voting for this because you just testified that there would be. Because the process is they can tell the LRC to post things. But he has chosen not to, and they never had a plan probably to do so anyway.
Yeah, I was very sad to see that development too, because at least I knew some of the bills that we were going to be confronting. In this session, really, the only bill we really seriously had to confront was House Bill 509, but through the years, I've certainly relied on that pre-filed status to identify bills.
Everybody has,
Yeah.
from the journalists to lobbyists. And there was a late filed bill, 819, which would have restored the pre-file process. It never got a hearing. But watch for it, because I'm pretty sure that there are other legislators who actually do care about pre-filing because their constituents are upset about it, or because some of the agencies and lobbyists that they work very closely with are also upset about it.
Marilyn?
Well, the thing with pre-filing is you don't have to pre-file. If you want to sit with the bill, okay.
Yeah, nobody was forcing you to do it.
Yeah, but there ought to be a way, maybe the league could step in and say, if you want us to help get the word out that you have this bill.
Yes, I think that would be great, but it would take somebody with a little more clout than us. Because that was the weird thing about Osborne's testimony, was he kept saying, nobody understands that these are draft bills and we just don't want things out there that people are going to argue about. I mean, that was in his testimony, and I was like, everyone understands it said pre-file, so, and yet all the interim committees are having conversations about particular topics that are going to get filed. So I don't understand the kind of, well, if we take away the pre-files, then people won't know what we're doing.
Maybe isn't one of the things in the 509 to talk about people being able to have public records on private devices, that some of what was said is that people then have their privacy violated by having to turn in their private device. That's never happened.
Right. Even the sponsor himself acknowledged that he had never heard of a single instance in which an individual was required to hand over his personal cell phone for the agency's records custodian to randomly go through the file, the personal email and or text, and determine which would be responsive to an open records request. And the analogy I've always drawn, and I gotta tell you something, I think this law, and Joe Clark did an amazing job in 1976, this law has somehow weathered time and come out on the other end, and it's just as workable. It's like the U.S. Constitution. It just works. And the truth is, you were never required, as if you had a paper in your file cabinet at home, you weren't required to wheel your file cabinet into the records custodian's office, or even if it was in your office, your public office. The reality is, it's always been if you have records responsive to this request, please forward them to the records custodian, who will then review them and then make a decision about whether they must be disclosed or they can be withheld. And the bottom line is, it is a complete fiction. They know it's a fiction. They absolutely know it's a fiction. And they've gotten more hysterical. There was an opinion issued last week by the Kentucky Attorney General where they go into all sorts of you talk about hyperbole, about privacy rights. And again, they're pushing the envelope because they're saying even if we assume that individuals will go through their own cell phone and produce it, that a judge could still require them to surrender their phone. And again, not a single instance in which that has happened. And quite frankly, if there's reason to believe that someone's concealing a public record, I don't even have a problem with a judge requiring them to disclose So this is the fiction. This is the myth, and this is why this was so deeply offensive, because they had absolutely no proof. And when push came to shove and the sponsor was asked, he said, no, I can't cite a single example of a case. There's a guy named Elkins who said he was required to, and my response to that was, he's a state legislator, and I wanted to say, then you're an idiot. Because what you should have said is, no, I will go through my records and I will tell you, here they are. Here's the ones I will forward to you, the ones that are responsive. And if you conceal a public record, that is a criminal offense, tampering with public record. It's also an offense under the Open Records Law, for which penalties can be imposed. So the reality is this all really does work. But they're refusing. They want to postulate this tension that now exists because we're in this age of automation and electronic record keeping. It doesn't matter if it's a hard copy record. It doesn't matter if it's a record maintained in an electronic format. The same obligations apply. And that's why it was so deeply offensive, because you could shout from the, I just know that, I was working with Americans for Prosperity, that young man who spoke that day, because this is how you're going to get them to listen. They're going to listen to conservatives, if they're going to listen at all. Chances are they're not going to listen at all. But they're certainly not going to listen to the Press Association, because they've heard the same thing or the Kentucky Open Government Coalition. They've heard the same thing time and time and time again. So the reality is, when push came to shove, Hodgson just would not move on this issue of people can be entrusted to, and there is a leap of faith that you have to take that a public servant will disclose. But if he doesn't disclose, and you have evidence that record exists, and yes, evidence is hard to come by, but it is tampering with a public record, is concealing a record when you know you can't withhold it. So the truth is, this I just wish that people could understand that we have it's not a great law. The myth that we have a great law is a myth. But we have a good, solid law that does work. And every time they go in there and muck about with it, they make it a less strong law and a less robust law, and they do it to your detriment.
Anybody else?
That's a good exit line.
Well, thank you all so much for sharing your insight into our open meetings, open records, lack of openness in parts of government. Today was the first day of early voting, so we've got 2 more days, tomorrow and Saturday, and then of course Election Day is on Tuesday. Our next forum will be on the 20th of June. We'll have a different location, different time. It's going to be at 6 o'clock at the library. And our speaker is going to be UK law professor Josh Douglas, who is speaking about his new book, The Court versus the Voter, How the Supreme Court Has Undermined Voting Rights, which is pretty timely. So that will be, again, June 20th at 6 o'clock at the library. So we hope to see you all there. And remember, these are being recorded. The Plant Board is kindly recording these forums for us. You can see them on the Plant Board YouTube channel and on the Together Frankfort website, where you can also donate and join. And before they escape, we have some gifts for our speakers.
Oh, how that's sweet.
We
Thank you.
appreciate y'all taking time out of your schedule.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Oh, goody.
Thank you all for being
My
here.
favorite.
See you next month.